An 88-year-old war veteran hadn't stepped outside his house in 4 years, and most of the town assumed he simply wanted to be left alone. But when one neighbor mentioned him to a biker passing through town, something unexpected happened that would bring 30 roaring motorcycles to a quiet street and change the old man's life forever. Walter Briggs once carried himself like a man carved from stone. In photographs from decades ago, he stood tall in a crisp uniform, shoulders square, eyes steady, the kind of presence that made people instinctively straighten when he walked into a room. In 1952, he had been a young soldier shipped across the ocean into the cold mountains of Korea, where he learned quickly that survival depended on the man beside you. Those years hardened him, but also gave him a brotherhood he never forgot. When he returned home after the war, he built a life that was quiet but proud. He married a woman named Helen, worked 35 years as a mechanic at a local garage, and raised a son who eventually moved away to chase opportunities in another state. For most of his life, Walter was known around Maple Street as the man who always waved first. He shoveled snow from elderly neighbors' driveways before they woke up. He fixed broken lawnmowers without charging a dime. He attended the town's Veterans Parade every single year, wearing the same carefully pressed jacket decorated with medals that meant far more than the metal they were made of. But time has a way of quietly changing things. First, Helen got sick. Cancer moved fast, and within a year the house that had once echoed with laughter fell painfully quiet. Walter tried to keep his routine the same afterward: morning coffee at the diner, evening walks around the block. But grief crept in slowly, like fog settling into a valley. When his son moved across the country for work, promising he would visit more often than he actually could, the silence inside the little white house grew heavier. The years passed, and Walter stopped doing small things people once took for granted. He stopped going to church because climbing the front steps became harder. He stopped attending the veterans' gatherings because he didn't want anyone to see how much slower he walked now. Eventually, he stopped leaving the house altogether. At first, neighbors thought he was just resting more, the way older folks sometimes do. But weeks turned into months, and months into years. The curtains remained closed most days. The lawn slowly grew uneven. The mailbox overflowed until the mail carriers started leaving bundles on the porch. Some people knocked occasionally, but Walter rarely answered. It wasn't that he disliked people. It was that stepping outside reminded him of everything that had changed. Inside the house, things stayed familiar. The same worn armchair faced the same old radio that hummed with the voices of talk shows and baseball games. The same photograph sat on the mantel. Helen smiling in a summer dress, a young soldier version of Walter standing beside a tank crew, and a faded picture of his son holding a fishing rod almost as tall as he was. Inside those walls, time moved slower, gentler. But outside, the world kept moving without him. For years passed like that. For long years where Walter Briggs barely crossed the threshold of his own front door. The only person who truly noticed how bad things had become was the young woman who lived next door. Her name was Emily Carter, a 27-year-old barista who had moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier. At first, she knew almost nothing about the quiet old man in the White House except what other neighbors mentioned in passing: that he was a veteran, that his wife had died, that he mostly kept to himself now. But Emily was the kind of person who noticed small details others overlooked. She noticed the way grocery delivery bags sometimes sat untouched on Walter's porch for hours. She noticed how the trash bins rarely made it to the curb anymore. Once, while taking out her own garbage, she saw Walter through the window struggling to lift a kettle with hands that trembled slightly. Something about the image stayed with her. A few days later, she'd baked banana bread and left it on his porch with a small handwritten note that simply read, "From your neighbor next door. No need to answer. Just wanted to say hello." To her surprise, the door opened a few minutes later. Walter stood there looking cautious but polite, holding the warm loaf like it was something fragile. They spoke only briefly that first time, but Emily saw something behind his tired eyes, a mixture of loneliness and pride that made him reluctant to ask anyone for help. After that day, she occasionally brought groceries or small meals by his porch. Sometimes he answered the door. Sometimes he didn't. But the small routine continued quietly for months. Then one afternoon, everything changed in a way Emily didn't expect. She was walking back from work when she saw Walter outside, standing at the edge of his driveway with a trash bag in one hand. The bag wasn't large, but he looked like he had just run a marathon trying to carry it. His shoulders sagged, and he paused every few steps as if gathering strength just to keep moving. Emily hurried over to help, but what unsettled her wasn't just how weak he looked. It was the realization that if he had fallen right there on the driveway, no one would have known for hours, maybe even days. That night at the coffee shop where she worked, Emily mentioned Walter while chatting with a regular customer who had stopped in for a late cup of coffee. She didn't expect much from the conversation, just a passing remark about the elderly veteran next door who seemed increasingly alone. But the man listening grew unusually quiet as she spoke. He was a tall, broad-shouldered biker with a gray beard and a calm presence, someone Emily had seen around town before but never spoken to for long. After a moment, he asked a simple question. "You said he's a veteran?" Emily nodded. The biker leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before finishing his coffee. Then he said something that would set the entire story in motion. "Mind showing me where that house is?" Emily blinked, slightly confused by the request. The man introduced himself as Jake Carter, a former Marine who rode with a local motorcycle club made up mostly of veterans and mechanics. He didn't say much else that night, but the serious expression on his face made it clear that Walter Briggs' quiet struggle had struck a nerve. Emily didn't realize it yet, but that simple conversation over coffee would lead to something no one on Maple Street had ever seen before. Because a week later, on an otherwise ordinary Saturday morning, the peaceful neighborhood would hear a sound that started as a distant rumble and grew louder with every passing second. The unmistakable roar of dozens of motorcycle engines heading straight toward the lonely white house, where an 88-year-old veteran had been slowly disappearing from the world. The quiet street had never heard anything like it before. Dozens of motorcycle engines rolling closer, the deep rumble echoing between the houses until curtains began to move and neighbors stepped outside to see what was happening. Inside the small white house, Walter Briggs was sitting in his usual chair beside the old radio when the sound first reached him. At first he thought it was a storm approaching, or maybe construction somewhere down the road. But the noise grew louder, more distinct, until it became clear that the engines were stopping right outside his house. Walter frowned and slowly stood up, his knees stiff from years of moving too little. He shuffled toward the front window and gently pushed the curtain aside. What he saw made him blink in disbelief. Motorcycles, rows and rows of them, lined the street. Leather jackets, boots hitting pavement, men and women climbing off bikes that gleamed under the morning sun. For a moment, Walter's first instinct was worry. In his younger years, he had seen enough rough crowds to know that a gathering like that could mean trouble. But then something strange happened. One of the riders stepped forward, removed his helmet, and walked calmly up the path toward Walter's porch. The man stopped at the bottom step, stood up straight, and raised his hand in a clean, respectful salute. Walter froze. It was a salute he recognized instantly, the kind soldiers give each other without needing words. The man lowered his hand and spoke in a steady voice. "Morning, sir. Marine Corps veteran Jake Carter." Walter stared at him, confused but alert. The young woman next door, Emily, appeared behind the group, offering a small, nervous wave as if to say this was somehow her doing. Jake continued carefully, almost like he didn't want to overwhelm the old man. "Your neighbor mentioned you at the coffee shop last week. Said you served in Korea." Walter nodded slowly, still unsure where the conversation was heading. "That's right," he replied quietly. Jake glanced back at the long line of riders filling the street. "A few of us heard about that. Figure we should stop by and say hello." Walter looked from Jake to the motorcycles again, clearly trying to process what he was seeing. "This is a lot of hello," he muttered. A few of the bikers chuckled softly, but there was nothing mocking in their laughter. If anything, the atmosphere felt surprisingly respectful. Jake took a step closer to the porch rail. "Truth is, sir, a lot of these riders are veterans too. Army, Marines, Navy. Some of us just believe nobody who served should ever feel forgotten." For a long moment Walter didn't speak. His expression softened slightly, but the habits of pride and independence still sat firmly on his shoulders. Finally, he opened the front door a little wider. "Well, you came all this way. Might as well step in for a minute." The invitation was small, but it was enough. Over the next hour, the quiet house saw more activity than it had in years. Not everyone crowded inside. Most stayed outside chatting on the lawn, but a few riders joined Walter in the living room, where they noticed things that revealed how much he had been struggling alone. The ceiling in the kitchen had a small water stain where the roof leaked. The front door hinge creaked loudly every time it moved. The wooden porch steps outside sagged slightly from rot. None of it was dramatic damage, just the slow wear of a house that hadn't had repairs in a long time. Jake stepped outside again and spoke quietly with the group. Within minutes, the visit turned into something else entirely. One biker who worked as a contractor grabbed tools from his saddlebag and examined the porch steps. Another rider who owned a roofing company climbed up a ladder someone fetched from a truck down the street and inspected the leak. Someone else began clearing weeds from the small yard that had slowly grown wild. Walter stood in the doorway watching it all unfold like a man witnessing a dream he didn't quite trust yet. "You don't have to do that," he called out after a while. Jake looked up from where he was tightening a loose railing bolt and gave a small shrug. "We know, sir, but we'd like to." Throughout the afternoon, the house slowly transformed. The broken porch board was replaced. The front gate that had sagged crooked for years was straightened and reinforced. Someone even brought fresh paint and touched up the peeling white trim around the windows. But the real change wasn't the repairs. It was the conversation that filled the air. For the first time in years, Walter found himself surrounded by people who wanted to hear his stories. They asked about Korea, about the tank crew he served with, about the cold winters in the mountains and the friendships forged in places far from home. At first he spoke cautiously, the way old soldiers often do when memories are heavy. But as the afternoon went on, something began to loosen inside him. He laughed when describing a mechanic who once repaired a damaged engine using nothing but wire and stubborn determination. He grew quiet when mentioning the crew members who never made it back. The bikers listened carefully, not interrupting, nodding with the kind of understanding that comes from shared experience. Jake noticed something else too. Every time Walter mentioned his late wife Helen, his voice softened in a way that made the entire room respectful. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, the work outside finally slowed. The yard looked cleaner. The house looked steadier. And Walter looked different somehow. Less like a man hiding from the world, and more like someone remembering how it felt to belong to it. Eventually the riders began preparing to leave. Helmets went back on. Engines started one by one. Walter stepped onto the repaired porch and watched them gather on the street. Jake approached him one last time before climbing onto his bike. "We'll check in again sometime," Jake said casually. Walter folded his arms, pretending to be skeptical even though a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You boys planning to invade the neighborhood every weekend?" Jake chuckled. "Not invade. Visit." He paused for a second, then added something that caught Walter's attention. "Actually, we were thinking about next Saturday." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Next Saturday?" Jake nodded toward one of the bikes parked nearby, an older model that looked freshly restored. "Thought maybe you'd like to come for a ride." Walter stared at the motorcycle for several seconds. The last time he had ridden one was sometime in the 1950s, back when he was a young mechanic trying to impress Helen on summer evenings. The idea seemed almost ridiculous now. "Son," he said slowly, "I'm 88 years old." Jake didn't look discouraged. In fact, his smile widened slightly. "That's exactly why we figured it's about time you got out of the house again." Walter didn't give an answer right away. But as the engines roared to life and the line of motorcycles rolled slowly away from Maple Street, something unfamiliar stirred inside him. Something that had been quiet for 4 long years. For the first time in a very long time, Walter Briggs found himself thinking about what it might feel like to step beyond his front porch again. And he had no idea that the following Saturday would bring a moment that the entire town would remember for years to come. All week long, Walter Briggs kept thinking about the invitation he had tried to brush off as a joke. For 4 years he had barely stepped past the edge of his porch. Yet now the image of that restored motorcycle and the promise of a ride kept returning to his mind at the most unexpected moments. The house was quieter than usual that week, not because the radio had stopped playing or the clock had stopped ticking, but because Walter found himself sitting in his armchair staring out the window more often than before. Part of him still believed the bikers had only been being polite, that people with busy lives would forget about an old man's porch conversation by the time the weekend arrived. But another part of him, the part that once rode across cold mountains with a tank crew he trusted with his life, wondered if maybe they meant exactly what they said. Saturday morning arrived with a clear sky and the kind of sunlight that made the small houses on Maple Street glow softly. Walter woke earlier than usual, though he pretended to himself that it was just habit. He made coffee, walked slowly through the house, and paused in front of the old wooden dresser where his military jacket still hung carefully preserved. His fingers brushed across the fabric, feeling the edges of metals he hadn't worn in years. For a moment he considered putting it on, then shook his head and muttered to himself that he wasn't going anywhere anyway. Still, he left the jacket draped neatly over the back of a chair in the living room. Around mid-morning, the distant sound of engines began to rumble through the quiet neighborhood again. At first it was faint, but within seconds the unmistakable growl of motorcycles filled the air, just like the weekend before. Walter moved to the front window, his heartbeat strangely quick for a man who had spent decades staying calm under pressure. The street was filling again, bike after bike rolling into place along the curb. Neighbors stepped outside onto lawns and porches, whispering to one another with curiosity and excitement. When the engines finally went silent, Jake Carter removed his helmet and walked toward the house with the same calm confidence he had shown the first time. But this time there was something new waiting in the driveway beside the porch. Parked carefully on the pavement was a beautifully restored military-style motorcycle with a polished metal sidecar attached to its side. The paint gleamed under the sunlight, and a small American flag fluttered gently from the back. Walter opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch, his eyes fixed on the machine. "You actually came back," he said quietly. Jake grinned. "Told you we would, sir." Walter pointed toward the sidecar with mild disbelief. "That thing for me." Jake nodded. Figured it'd be the safest way for a first ride. A few of the bikers standing nearby chuckled warmly, but their smiles were filled with encouragement rather than teasing. Emily stood among the small crowd of neighbors watching the moment unfold, clearly proud of what had grown out of a simple conversation at the coffee shop. Walter hesitated for a moment, gripping the porch railing as if measuring the distance between the man he had become and the man he once was. Then something shifted in his expression. Slowly, carefully, he stepped down the newly repaired stairs. The crowd fell quiet as Jake and another rider gently helped him into the sidecar seat. Walter adjusted himself, gripping the edge of the frame with both hands while Jake crouched beside him to secure a safety strap. "Comfortable?" Jake asked. Walter looked down the street where the motorcycles were lined up like an honor guard waiting for orders. A faint smile crept across his weathered face. "Son, I haven't been comfortable doing something this crazy in about 60 years. Laughter rippled through the riders. Moments later, engines roared back to life one by one, filling the air with a deep rolling thunder that echoed off the houses. Jake climbed onto the motorcycle, glanced back once to make sure Walter was ready, and gave a small nod. The convoy began moving slowly through the neighborhood. People came out of their homes to watch. Some waved. Others simply stood quietly, recognizing the small American flag fluttering beside the old man riding proudly in the sidecar. Walter sat upright, the wind brushing gently across his face as the houses passed by. At first he didn't say anything, but the farther they rode from the street where he had spent for silent years, the more his eyes seemed to come alive again. They cruised slowly through town, past the diner where Walter used to drink coffee every morning, past the park where he once walked with Helen during summer evenings, and past the mechanic shop where he had spent 3 decades repairing engines. Eventually Jake led the group to a quiet stop at the town's Veterans Memorial, a small stone monument surrounded by flags. The engines shut down, and the sudden silence felt powerful after the long ride. Jake helped Walter out of the sidecar and guided him toward a bench facing the memorial. For a moment, the old veteran simply stared at the engraved names carved into the stone. His hands trembled slightly as he rested them on his knees. "I thought the world forgot about us," he murmured after a long pause. Jake stood beside him with quiet respect. "Not a chance," he replied softly. "Not while we're still riding." Walter nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on the flags fluttering above the memorial. Around them, the bikers stood in a loose circle, hats removed, heads slightly bowed in silent understanding. That ride marked the beginning of something no one on Maple Street could have predicted. In the weeks that followed, the motorcycles returned often, not as a spectacle this time, but as regular visitors. Sometimes they drove Walter to doctor appointments or the grocery store. Sometimes they simply sat with him on the porch, sharing stories and coffee while the afternoon sun settled over the quiet street. Before long, Walter began leaving the house more frequently. He attended the bikers' weekly breakfast gatherings. He even returned to the diner where the staff greeted him like a long-lost friend. The house that had once seemed forgotten slowly became one of the liveliest spots in the neighborhood. Neighbors often saw motorcycles parked outside, while laughter drifted through the open windows. And the old man who had once spent years staring out from behind closed curtains became something unexpected again. A storyteller, a mentor, a living reminder of the sacrifices made long before many of the younger riders had been born. One evening, months after that first ride, Emily watched Walter sitting on his porch, surrounded by a few bikers while the sun set across Maple Street. He looked peaceful in a way she had never seen before. She smiled quietly to herself, realizing how a simple act of mentioning a lonely veteran had sparked something powerful. Because sometimes all it takes to change someone's life is one person willing to speak up and a group of strangers willing to show up. And thanks to that moment, the 88-year-old veteran who hadn't left his house in 4 years had found his way back into the world again, carried there by the roar of motorcycles and the loyalty of people who believe that no hero should ever be forgotten.